Hi everyone, and thanks for watching Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the Pluto Fresnel from Astera. This thing has a flood spot range from 13 degrees all the way out to 60 degrees. It has absolutely sensational barn door cuts, a CCT range from 1750 Kelvin all the way up to 20,000 Kelvin. It is full color gamut with all of the color modes that you could possibly want over DMX. In addition to that, it also has a built-in battery, which has a 3-hour and 10-minute runtime when set to 5,600 Kelvin, running at 100% brightness. Now, also in this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the box that they've made up to address what I'd consider to be the major negatives with this light. It also has built-in CRMX and it is weatherproof. Okay, let's start off by going through the regular disclaimers. Astera are not paying me any money for this episode, and they have no say in the edit or my opinions. But they did send me the light for free, and I do get to keep it or sell it at the end of the episode, which technically makes that a paid endorsement, which is why you get the little warning at the start of the episode. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the optical attachment that's available for it, the projection mount. Now, I'm not going to be covering this projection mount in this episode because this thing is so good, I think it deserves its own episode, and it's going to take quite a bit of testing using this unit to get an episode together. So that'll be in a following episode. Now, this is a zoomer. It goes from 16 degrees to 36 degrees, and I think in terms of a zoomer, it's the best optical zoomer I think I've ever seen. The optics are beautiful on it. Now, the other reason I'm mentioning this now is the light itself is not a very bright light. So with the Fren-l attached, I would rate this, or it feels to me to be something around a 300 watt tungsten. So you might have the incorrect perception that if you take this light and then put an optical accessory on the front of it, it won't be very bright. You actually do gain more light level through the projector than you get out of the Fren-l. You get about 140% more, and that's with the projector mount in its widest spread. Now let's start off the review with price and what you get. Now, I normally don't start a review at this point, but I think the price point of this light is going to be a deciding factor for a lot of people. This is not a cheaply built light, and that is reflected in the price. However, I do believe that the price point is very reasonable when you look at the build quality of the light. But I think a lot of people are going to get caught up in the fact that this is only an 80 watt light, and it does cost a lot of money, dollars versus watt. All right, so let's have a look at what you get in a basic kit. So you get the light, of course, with a removable Fren-l, and the light comes with a stirrup. You get a safety wire or safety chain. You get a set of 8-leaf barn doors. You get the instruction manual. You get a carry handle that mounts to the top of the light. And you get a power supply and a power cable. And all of that costs $1,440 US, and I've seen it advertised today in Australia at 2,189 Australian dollars. Now, in addition to that, you might also want to get the PowerBox 1x100 watt unit here. So this addresses a lot of issues that I have with the light. Now, this box is an additional $240 US and about 370 Australian dollars. Now, this comes with a regional power cable. Now, in addition to that, if you want to run this thing off V-mount batteries, you might also want to get the runtime extender, which is a battery plate that mounts onto the side of the light here. That costs you an additional $206 US and about 320 Australian dollars. Okay, let's go through the pros and cons now, and we'll start off with the cons to get them out of the way. Now, I'm going to break the cons up into a couple of sections. So the first section of cons is to do with the connection point on the back. Okay, so the reason I'm breaking these up is because a lot of people have complained about this, and Astera have made a solution to all of these negatives. They've actually made up a power box that connects to the side of the light that resolves all of the issues that I'm going to go through. Now, of course, this is additional money and it is additional weight, so that in itself is a bit of a negative. So let's go through these negatives first. Now, on the back of the light, it's only got the one cable input. This shares both power and data. So this worked fantastic on their previous lights and everybody loved it, because on a tube light, you don't have a lot of room for XLR connectors. for, say, your DMX. You don't have room for PowerCon connectors or PowerCon through connectors. There simply isn't the space. Plus, also having this one small cable going into the light looks very elegant if you've got it in shot. You've only got the one cable. You don't have a mess of cables you've got to hide. And you know, everybody loved that and it made a lot of sense, but it doesn't really apply to a Fren-l, or at least with my thinking, it doesn't work here at all. So let's start going through the obvious problems. Let's say you're using this in a lighting grid and you want to run DMX to it. Hardwired DMX, not CRMX. You don't have any DMX connectors on the back. So you can't simply put this up into your lighting grid and then just daisy chain it in with the rest of your lights up there. It's not going to work. Now, in addition to that, when you plug the power supply in that's sold with the light, the power supply doesn't have any DMX inlet on it either. So you've got no way of hardwiring DMX into this if you're hoping to use it with what's supplied in the box on your initial purchase. Now, in my testing, I found this light only has a maximum power draw of around 85 watts. So here's my next negative. If you've got a whole stack of these in a lighting grid, you can't daisy chain the power. It is literally a one-to-one power connection. So that's a bit of a negative in terms of rigging time. The next possible negative is the voltage on the DC inlet. It's 24 volts. So that means if you want to power it off an external V-mount battery, for example, you can't just buy a D-tap adapter cable and plug it directly into the back. It's an incorrect voltage. So here's another possible solution you might be thinking of. Well, let's get a Tether Tools adapter, for example. So this thing converts from your D-tap adapter to AC power out. Now, in theory, this can supply enough power to run 2 of these lights, but this won't work either, because the power supply that comes with the light has the worst power factor unity scores that I've ever seen on any product that's come in for review. So if you want to run a power supply off a small inverter, you want a power supply that has a power factor unity score of 90 plus, so that's 0.90 and higher. This thing comes in at 0.64, so it's definitely going to fry the electronics. So if you want to run this off a V-mount battery or a gold mount battery, your best bet is the runtime extender, which is sold as a separate item from Astera. Now let's have a look at the solution to the other possible problems I've mentioned so far, and this is called the PowerBox 1x100. Now this has a quality transformer in it that doesn't suffer from those power factor unity issues. Now this attaches directly to the side of the light. The housing is extremely durable. It's all made of die-cast metal, and it has an IP65 weather rating. It has AC in and out. It has two 24-volt outputs that can run a total of 100 watts combined. So that'll only run the one Pluto, but you could use it to run 2 tubes. It has your DMX 5-pin in and out, and for you guys working on the bigger projects, it also has an Ethernet input. Now, when I first put this on the light straight out of the box, I found it to be very elegant, very easy to mount to the light, and also very useless because it is not sold with a cable that connects the box to the light, so make sure you order a cable. Now, just something to be aware of with the box. Now, let's say the light is receiving a CRMX command. Now, this box does not convert that CRMX command into a wired DMX output. Now, the next negatives I'm going to talk about are possible negatives to do with the battery management system for the internal battery. All right, so you might be sort of anticipating that you can run this light off the internal battery. And then when you get to a location that has AC power, you'll be able to plug the AC power in, run the light off the AC power, and simultaneously charge the battery. Now that won't happen unless the light is running at extremely low brightness levels. Now let me explain why that is. If you could run the light at full power and simultaneously charge it, you could be exceeding the power limits on things like your connectors, your cables, your power supplies, and if you've got hundreds of these things on set, even the power limitations of the studio or the venue that you're working in. Now here's the next limitation. Even if you do have this running at a low brightness level, it has to be running at that really low brightness level for at least 20 minutes before the charging will start. Now here's the logic with that. If it's been running at the consistent brightness level for 20 minutes, it is very unlikely that someone's going to come along and put additional commands into the light. So it is pretty safe to assume at that point that it is safe to charge the light and simultaneously run it. Now, the other scenario to be aware of is if the internal battery is too hot, it won't charge. So what I have found is if I'm running the light off the internal battery for hours on end, and then I go to put it on charge, it can be up to a 50-minute delay before the light starts charging. The other scenario is if you're running the light at full power off AC, the inside of the light still gets hot enough that the internal battery won't take a charge, even though you haven't been powering it off the internal battery. In that situation, you can have a delay of 20 to 30 minutes before it'll start charging. Now, I think this light has the best build quality of any light in this class of product, but here's the thing, that comes at the cost of weight. So with the Fren-l, the barn doors attached to the stirrup, the handle on the top, I weigh this thing in at 6.6 kilograms. Now, if you add the optional box onto the side, that's another 1.1 kilograms, and that gets you up to a whopping 7.7 kilograms. Now, the last possible negative, at 5,600 Kelvin, this light doesn't have the sexiest color render scores compared to some of its competition. Now let's start going through the pros, and the biggest pro for me is the quality of the optics. Now, I put that down to the fact that it is a genuine point source light underneath the Fren-l lens. That is literally smaller than my thumbnail. So that gives you very crisp shadows and very good barn door cuts. Now, in terms of the barn door cuts, my next favorite thing about this light is the barn doors, which might sound like an odd thing to praise, but the barn doors have this coating on the inside of them that feels rubbery. I don't know what it is, but it really absorbs light. So for example, if I do a barn door cut, I don't get light bouncing off the barn door and messing up my cuts, particularly on fine cuts like this. In addition to that, they are 8-leaf barn doors. So you can get some real good control over the light coming out of the unit with the Fren-l. Now, in terms of the control that you've got over the light, the next thing I really like about this is it's got a built-in spill guard here, so you don't have light coming out of the side like you can get on other Fren-ls. The next pro for me is, unlike Fren-l attachments, this actually has a decent beam angle range, from 13 degrees up to 60 degrees. Now, the next big plus for me with this light is the Titan light engine. I really like the Titan light engine when it comes to low CCTs. It can get all the way down to 1,750 Kelvin, but not just that, it's actually usable. It has a nice thick spectrum that looks like it could be coming from candlelight and not some industrial vapor light, which other LEDs tend to look like. And it has a pretty good TN30 color render score of 93, but at 2,500 Kelvin, this thing really heroes. The color render scores are fantastic, and in all honesty, the Titan light engine is my go-to at the moment if I need to work in low kelvins. Now, here's something I like with the stirrup. This is quite an interesting little trick. Now, for this to work, you've got to take the spigot out, but it is worth the effort. Check this out. How cool is that? Now, with the spigot removed, you can easily put a thread into place, which you could use for other mounting options such as articulated arms. And on the opposite side, there's a mount for a track pin. Now, the light also has 4 sets of mounting tracks. It's got a 6-position mounting track on the bottom. It's got a 6-position mounting track on the top, which the handle attaches to. And it's got 2 7-position tracks on the sides, which the stirrup attaches to. Now, just something to note here is the stirrup is in position number 2 and it is front heavy. If I put it into position number 1, it's going to be back heavy. So these positions don't really help you get a fine center of gravity, but they are a plus when it comes to additional rigging points. Now, if I want to use a light like this in a combo stand, one thing I always appreciate is having somewhere to store the locker, so I'm not going to lose it. Now, here I've got it in what I'd consider to be its maximum configuration as a Fren-l, but let's have a look at how easy this thing is to configure. So let's say, for example, we want to have it rigged in shop, but we don't want it looking like a film and TV light. Well, things you can do easy enough. You can remove the barn doors, no surprise there. You can remove the Fren-l if you want to, but let's leave that attached for the moment. The PowerBox on the side is easy to remove. The top handle, well, that comes off very, very easily. And even the stirrup can be easily removed. But the locking system on the stirrup does have a nice safety mechanism to it. So I'm pressing the release and it's not coming out. So what you need to do is undo the tension all the way. So when you do that, it separates the inside from the outside on the locking mechanism. And then you just simply press 2 releases and the stirrup comes free as well. Now, let's say we want to take off the stirrup mounts on the side. Well, they just unscrew and then slide it down the rail until you get to a release point. So this is very, very configurable. Now just quickly going through the last of the pros, it has the Astera user interface. So that means the bulk of lighting assistants out there already know how to use this light. The bulk of the housing is metal, including the flood spot mechanism, which is really, really precise. It has an IP55 rating, and of course, my last favorite thing is built-in CRMX control. Let's take a look at the light with no modifier attached, and the entire LED array is smaller than my thumbnail. So I would be expecting these shadows to be absolutely razor sharp. They are so sharp that you can see the hair on the back of my hand. As you would expect, the light has a massive even spread. Now, just something to note, normally I take my f-stop readings at 400 ISO, but with this light I'm taking them at 800 ISO because it's not very bright. Now, the beam spread and shadow characteristics seem to be the same regardless of the CCT or colour that you dial in. When used with the barn doors, you get fantastic cuts with very little concaving or convexing. Now have a look here. When I open up the barn doors, the ambience fills the shadow. But when I close the barn doors, there is virtually no bounce off the barn doors into the shadow area. Now let's take a look with the Fren-l attached. And as you can see, the LED array fits into the center ring of the Fren-l. So I would be expecting this light in full flood to be almost as razor sharp as it was without the Fren-l. And it almost is. The only difference is you can't really see the detail on the hairs on the back of my hand. With the Fren-l attached, we have reduced the maximum beam angle to 60 degrees. But the trade-off is in flood, we get an extra 17% brightness, and we can flood spot, of course. The Fren-l does have a nice even beam with a beautiful soft drop-off, much like the old school Fren-ls we used to use in the tungsten days. The results seem to be the same regardless of CCT or colour dialed in. Here's where this light is amazing. With the barn door cuts, there is virtually no concaving or convexing. Now I'm lining my cuts up to the garage door so that you can see what looks like convexing is actually the camera lens. And again, just have a look at how clean the cut is. There is no barn door bounce going into those blacks. Now let's take a look at the light in full spot. Now it has a very clean spot for a Fren-l, but it's not the cleanest spot I've seen. I'd have to say that belongs to the Felix Q5. But if you're exposing for the highlights, you can see that it is quite a clean beam. Now we're going to get into the DMX Cue testing, and this is essentially 3 minutes of lights fading up and fading down. So if that doesn't apply to you, that's 3 minutes of your life you're not going to get back. So I'd suggest skipping this chapter. Now the one thing I do want to point out is on the final test where I'm going from white light transitioning into color, I found it very disorientating watching it, trying to figure out which lights were correct and which lights weren't. So what I've done is I've put the word cue up on the screen when the cue started. Okay, let's start off the DMX testing. The Pluto is receiving its DMX commands via its internal CRMX receiver. It is running off the 8-bit CCT and HSI crossover profile. It is set to maximum output brightness and is running off its standard dimmer curves. To give you another light to compare it to, I have a Titan tube. Now this is not a brightness comparison. The Titan tube has 3 f-stops of ND. The reason I'm testing this against the Titan tube is in case you have a lot of Astera product, you can see how well the Pluto ties into your existing Astera products. And the last light we're going to compare it to is a SkyPanel S60C. The SkyPanel S60C is running off an external CRMX receiver, its dimmer curve is set to linear, and it is running off the 8-bit HSI CCT profile. Again, this is not a brightness comparison. The SkyPanel S60C also has 3 f-stops of ND attached to the front. All 3 lights will be receiving their commands at the same time. Let's start the testing with instant on-off commands. Now let's have a look at some half-second cues. Now let's have a look at some 1-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 2.5-second cues. And now for some 5-second cues. Now let's have a look at some changeovers between 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant changeovers. Now for some half-second changeovers. Now for some 1-second changeovers. Now for some 2.5-second changeovers. And now for some 5-second changeovers. Now for some changeovers between a CCT and a colour hue, starting off with instant changeovers. Now for some half-second changeovers. Now for some 1-second changeovers. Now for some 2.5-second changeovers. And now for some 5-second changeovers. Let's start going through the data I've collected, starting off with AC power draw. The maximum AC power draw recorded over several days of testing was 84.8 watt, and that was when the light was turned off and charging its internal battery. At 3200 Kelvin, I measure 82 watt, and at 5600 Kelvin, I measure 67 watt. Now let's take a look at the power factor unity scores for the supplied power supply. And these are the worst numbers I've ever seen on a gear review. You definitely wouldn't want to run this power supply powering from a small inverter. But if you're running off house power from the power grid, you could probably run dozens of these without a problem. Now let's take a look at the power factor unity scores with the optional extra power box. And these power factor unity scores are about what I would expect. Now let's have a look at the dimming characteristics. And this light is run in scattered pulse width modulation. However, it is confusing my frequency meter. For some reason, my meter seems to think this light is running at about 3 kHz. Now I've taken photos with high-speed shutters and I can't see any flicker at all. So I'm willing to conclude that my meter is wrong and this light is indeed flicker-free. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics at 3200 Kelvin. I've taken readings at 100%, 75%, 50%, 25%, 10%, 5%, and 1%. The CCT remains incredibly consistent. The TM30 color render score remains the same all the way down to 5%, but the light does skew towards magenta as you dim it. Down at 5%, the total amount of skew is well under that of a 1/8 correction gel. Now just something to note, at 1% brightness, I can see flickering in the light engine with my naked eye, but I highly doubt you'd be using the light at 1%. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics at 5600 Kelvin. And once again, the CCT is incredibly consistent. The TM30 RF color scores are a consistent 92, and from 50% and below, the light again skews magenta, by within the tolerance range of about a 1/8 correction gel. And again at 1%, there is some noticeable flicker when you're looking at the light with your eye. Now let's take a look at the CCT target value accuracies. Now I've broken up the average readings into several sections here, so that the averages won't be misleading. In a nutshell, from 1750 Kelvin up to 2450 Kelvin, the light reads under the target value. From 2500 Kelvin and upwards, the light reads over the target value. The higher the CCT you dial in, the more the light is out by. Now here's the spectrometer information for the high kelvins. And as you can see with your super high kelvins, you might as well not be looking at the screen when you dial in a CCT. Some of these readings are well over the target value. Now let's take a look at the TM30 color render scores. And I've taken readings at every CCT from 1750 Kelvin all the way up to 6000 Kelvin. At 1750 Kelvin, it starts with a score of 93, and it sharply increases up to 96 by the time you get to 2250 Kelvin. From 3300 Kelvin onwards, the color render scores slowly decrease. And by the time you get to 5500 Kelvin, it's down to 92. Now let's take a look at our delta UV or white point placement. This gives you an indication of how green or magenta the light skews at the different CCT values. From 1750 to 2450 Kelvin, the light skews slightly magenta with a pretty consistent average of minus 0.0019. Now from 2500 Kelvin to 3000 Kelvin, it slowly makes its way up to 0 delta UV, which is why I haven't given the light an average. From 3050 Kelvin up to 4500 Kelvin, the light is tracking near perfect to the Planckian curve with an extremely impressive average delta UV of only plus or minus 0.0002. From 4550 to 5000 Kelvin, it's breaking away from the Planckian curve and heading up towards the daylight curve, which is why I haven't given an average for this section. Now from 5000 Kelvin up to 6000 Kelvin, the light has a pretty consistent average of plus 0.0019 delta UV, which places the light in a safe zone between the daylight curve and the Planckian curve, with its bias more towards the daylight curve. Let's take a closer look at some of the kelvins, starting off with the lowest CCT we can dial in, 1750. When I dialed in 1750, I got 1733. The TM30 colour testing scores were 93% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R8, R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0012, which would make the light ever so slightly magenta at this point to roughly the equivalent of 1/3 of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's go through the readings at 2500 Kelvin, because at 2500 Kelvin, this light really heroes. When I dialed in 2500 Kelvin, I got 2509. The TM30 colour testing results were a very impressive 96% average colour accuracy with an average 103% colour saturation. All of the CRI scores are plus 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0017. which would make this light slightly magenta to about the equivalent of 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3236 with an SSI of 86. The TM30 colour testing results were 96% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the light is incredibly accurate with a delta UV of minus 0.0003. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4556. The TM30 colour testing results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 103% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point was incredibly accurate with a delta UV of minus 0.0003. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5773 with an SSI score of 73. The TM30 colour testing results were 92% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0019. So if you're working to the Planckian curve, this light would be slightly green to a little bit more than 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. If you're working to the daylight curve, then the light would be slightly magenta to roughly about 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. So the light is playing it safe and going in the middle ground. When I dialed in 10,000 Kelvin, I got 11,028. The TM30 colour testing scores were 88% average colour accuracy with an average 98% colour saturation, with the CRI scores R3, R6, R9, R10 and R11 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0038. When I dialed in the maximum Kelvin of 20,000, I got 25,806. There are no TM30 colour render scores, because this is outside the parameters of the testing requirements. Here are the CRI scores. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0062. Let's take a look at how accurately the Titan light engine can dial in its colour vectors. Red, which should be 0 degrees, came in at 1 degree. Green was smack on at 120 degrees. Blue was smack on at 240 degrees. Yellow, which should be 60 degrees, came in at 49. But if you want a good yellow, I'd recommend dialing in 56. Cyan, which should be 180, was very close at 176. And magenta, which should be 300, was very close at 291. For my workflow and how I would use a small powered Fren-l, this thing's just too big and too heavy for me. So it's a bit of a no for me in terms of as a Fren-l, but Am I going to sell this thing at the end of the review? Well, no, I'm going to keep it because of the projector mount. So I've got 10 other projector mounts, and if I had to light the brand name on a product in a product shot, this is the projector mount that I would use. See you on the next episode of Gaffer and Gear. Take care.